Welcome to episode 30 of After the Breach podcast. We're your hosts, Jeff and Sarah. And joining us today, I'm really excited about this episode, is Michael Weiss from the Center for Whale Research and Monika Wieland Shields from Orca Behavior Institute, two of our good friends. And they have come here tonight to talk to us about a topic that we've been talking about for quite a while. Kind of demystifying killer whales is kind of what we've been calling it. But hey, guys, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited about this episode. This is going to be fun.
We've been talking about this one for quite a while, in parts, spurts, and, you know.
We talk about it all the time.
We do.
When we're not recording.
Yeah, constantly.
We should have just been recording the whole time.
Yeah, we've been talking about this for, like 20 or 30 minutes beforehand, and we should have just run the tape.
We should have, but too late now.
But we'll recast it and start again. Are you going to start laughing already?
No, I'm done.
So I think we were going to start with talking about superpods. I think, was that where we were going to start? Because they only happen on
very abrupt
the west,
lead in there.
On the west side of San Juan Island. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I do. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what we mean by demystifying killer whales.
Okay. Well, I'm a jump in the deep end kind of guy, so
that's okay too.
Lead us into the shallow end. Whatever. I don't know.
Oh, Jeff.
Okay.
So we talk about this a lot. How there's a lot of kind of mysticism. I don't know how we want to put it, like mysticism surrounding killer whales. And, you know, a lot of the times we're like, no, they're just really cool, complex animals. And that seems to get overshadowed by what we as humans like to kind of assign to them from a human perspective. I don't know if I'm putting it the right way, but
I feel like another name for this episode, we'll see how it goes, could be like removing our kind of human projections, right? Like human projection onto killer whales is kind of, as we were talking before we started recording, was kind of a theme of a lot of the stuff we ended up putting in our outline. But yeah, I think mysticism's a good way to put it too sometimes.
Like anthropomorphizing.
Yeah, and finding the magic and appreciation of who they are for who they are, not for who we would like them to be or how we think they should be in our own heads, but who they really are.
Not making them this ideal culture that we should strive to be.
Yeah.
Since we've seen seen killer whales do a lot of things that, you know, would probably land us in prison for a very long time.
Yes. And we should strive to be an ideal culture for our own reasons, not because of anything that killer whales do.
But playing into all this and related to that is projecting human morals onto killer whale behavior, right? Where we say, oh, if we did that, we would get into trouble, but it might be completely normal within their world. So it's the same kind of thing, just differentiating between how we would respond in a situation or what we think might be happening versus the reality for them.
I wonder maybe, I know we kind of talked about starting with superpods, but now that we're on the subject of morality, I wonder if the bigs and residents kind of might be a place to start.
Yeah,
potentially, not to backseat host.
No, I was like,
no. I think this is a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've heard many times, and I'm sure you guys have heard it too, is, oh, I want to see southern residents and I don't want to see bigs because southern residents are the nice ones.
Yeah, the vegetarian whales, the friendlier whales.
They don't eat meat.
They don't kill other cetaceans.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Except they do.
Except wrong.
None of which is true. They have to kill many, many animals every day. It's just that the animals they're killing are not fuzzy. They don't have big doe eyes. We don't connect with them in the same way. They're killing lots and lots of salmon and other fish, and occasionally just killing porpoises for, I'm not going to say for no reason, but not for food.
But for whatever reason that they're doing it, we don't exactly know, but it's not a one-off thing. We've seen it many times, and
over decades and decades.
Right. So they have their own reason for doing it, and not for food.
Right. You know, most of the work I do is on southern residents. I love the southern residents. I feel that affinity for them. There is something special about watching southern residents on the west side, but yeah, I think it bugs all of us here a little bit when folks kind of privilege the southern residents, not in terms of, here's something about them that I find particularly interesting or, their endangered status, but because they're looked at as morally kind of superior to bigs,
Right.
because they don't eat animals that are cute and fuzzy, which does not make any sense philosophically, right? Does not make any ethical, moral
Sure.
sense, but it's such an instinct for us of watching these animals kill a seal, and you see the little head pop up and the big eyes look
sure.
terrified. Whereas when a salmon is running away from a killer whale, we don't connect with anything about that expression, right? There's nothing in that we can really empathize with unless we try really quite hard. So there's this natural kind of instinct to think, well, those guys are mean. They're hunting the cute thing. I wouldn't do that. Those guys are nice. They're hunting a slimy, weird, spiny thing. But there's nothing about it. And going back to, what you were saying, Monika, there's no reason to think that they think of moral judgments in either of those ways. In terms of, there's no reason to think a resident killer whale is only eating fish because they somehow morally privilege other marine mammals.
Which is probably absolutely not the case, but
Or
we
that
don't know. But
Or that they feel a sense of accomplishment and superiority over other ecotypes of killer whales.
I mean, if they do, it's probably not over that food that they eat.
Right.
Well, the flip side of that, some people want to see the southern residents because they think they're morally superior somehow. But the opposite side of that is some people think it's okay if we lose the southern residents because we have bigs here. So there will still be killer whales in these waters. And really, we're incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to get to know both of these populations. And I think they're both, inherently valuable and interesting and lovable in their own rights. But it doesn't mean we have to rank one against the other.
Nor should we.
No. Yeah. I think that's a good point. And I think through all of this, as we're going through, I think this has the potential to be us kind of going through and debunking things that people think are cool about killer whales. But I think it's important to remember that everyone in this room at this table loves these killer whales, thinks they're really cool. And when we say, resident killer whales don't have a moral value above that of bigs, that doesn't mean we don't care deeply about southern residents and want to have lots of southern residents around for a long time.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think, that's a really important distinction to make. The four of us are at this table and do what we do because of our very deep appreciation and love for all whales, all killer whales, ecotype agnostic.
I can't claim to be entirely ecotype agnostic, but that's my own kind of cross to bear, I think.
I've talked about this on several episodes, but as a newcomer relatively out here, I have more experience and knowledge about the bigs than I do southern residents. And so my personal feelings are, I love the southern residents, and that's who I first started watching when I first started coming out here. But I now feel like I don't know them nearly as well as I know the bigs. And just because I know them better and I'm seeing more of a daily fascination with them, I'm not ranking one above the other, but I think I have a little bit more affinity just because they're a lot more familiar, and the mysteries and the complexities are more visible to me on an ongoing daily basis.
So when you hear that a superpod is happening in Harrow Strait, what do you make of that as somebody who came in after that was kind of a common occurrence here?
I think that for me, it's like, wow, that's really cool because we don't see a lot of those in the inland waters anymore. And I know from talking to people who were here before me that there used to be bets of when in May are we going to have the first of many superpods on the west side of San Juan Island through the whole summer. And now if we get one or two in a season, it's a big deal. But I'm definitely also very aware that these whales exist and have total, complete lives when they're not on the west side of San Juan Island.
No. I don't believe it. They just pop out of existence when they leave the Salish Sea, and then they come back in, they go to a different. I don't know.
I do feel like
I'm just kidding.
That is kind
that
of
is a joke.
No,
That's
I know it's a joke, but I know it's a joke. But I do
for everyone
feel,
listening.
I do feel like, and you know, I don't want to be hated here, but I do feel like there is this concept out there, and it's not like for real, but people, it's almost like when they're not on the west side of San Juan Island, like they all go their separate ways, and they're all like, it's like things aren't happening in their lives, and you know, there's no way they could all be getting together. Like superpods would only happen here, and when they're gone from the west side of San Juan Island, it's like their lives are just blah.
Well, I think we need to be careful how we talk about some of these things, and I put myself in that category too. Like I've definitely said we don't see superpods the way that we used to, and that can be interpreted as superpods don't happen anymore. It's true we're not seeing them in the inland waters the way that we used to, but all evidence suggests that all three pods are meeting up regularly on the outer coast and having superpods out there doing, you know, whatever they do during those social times together as a community. It's just out of sight from where most of us live and tend to see them.
Yeah, we kind of have an observation bias.
Yeah, a big old observation bias, and that leads to some kind of interesting inferences that people make about the role of superpods and when superpods happen and what they mean. As you're saying, Monika, like, you know, all evidence suggests that when they're out on Swiftsure Bank, they spend like a large portion of their time in what we would call a superpod, with the whole population kind of in the same foraging area. You know, when CWR goes out there and takes, you know, does surveys, we find members of all three pods really regularly in the same group. But there tends to be this instinct when a superpod or something close to a superpod does show up, where more people kind of in the whale community are able to see them, to assign that some meaning and look for anything southern resident or killer whale related in the last, you know, few weeks or months that could be associated with it.
So one of the big ones in that regard is that they gather, or they only gather when there's a birth or a death in the population. And I think there have been some instances where those superpods are occurring when we become aware of a birth or a death in the population. And part of that might be because, you know, you, Michael, get out there and survey them one of the few times you get a chance to see the whole population and realize that there's been a change. And so that there's a correlation there that's not necessarily a causation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when a superpod happens, that is a prime time to do our survey, to fill in those gaps and see who's still there. And if you know there were 74 whales in the population and you get pictures of 73 in a day, that's a pretty good first sign. And it might be your first encounter, it might be your third missing that individual. And that tends to be when we realize that an animal's missing. So yeah, you know, perhaps they do gather when they lose individuals, perhaps they do gather for that kinds of things, but us seeing a superpod and then realizing a whale is missing does not indicate that the superpod is because a whale is missing. It's not necessarily when that whale died. Depending on when we last saw them, that whale could have gone missing months ago. It's just when we, as researchers and as the community, are realizing something these whales have known for a really long time.
I feel like, well, I had two things that you guys made me think of right then. One is, real quick, I think we should just clarify what a superpod is for those that don't know.
and where Swiftsure Bank is.
And because I feel like the term superpod gets thrown around, and sometimes quite loosely, especially in more recent years. So, Monika, you want to...
Yeah, well, I think all four of us are purists here at the table and go by the traditional definition of a southern resident superpod being the entire community together. Some people use the term more loosely as members of all three pods, but traditionally for southern residents, it means the entire community together. So recently, we had members of all three pods here in inland waters, but the L54 subgroup was not present, and so we would not call that a superpod.
So, and when we talk about the Center for Whale Research, seeing them on Swiftsure Bank and other accounts of seeing superpods out on Swiftsure Bank, that's the outer coast. That is not, the west side of San Juan Island. That is probably 80 miles away from the west side of San Juan Island, out on the outer coast. Very, very different conditions out there, different place altogether. And, I would think, just based by, Michael, your observations and accounts from others, that it's a much more frequent occurrence of having superpods than what we see when we're in the inland waters in this one small place.
Yeah, I mean, based on CWR data, and it's hard to say how long this has been the case because, surveys of southern residents out at Swiftsure Bank were not as regularly done throughout the whole study. But right now, I think if you find killer whales out, in western Juan de Fuca or, southwest Vancouver Island, you're much more likely to find a superpod than if you find southern residents in inland waters by a pretty significant degree. It doesn't mean they're always in a big superpod out there,
sure,
but pretty regularly, if we find southern residents out there, it's at least members of all three pods, and depending on how complete the survey is, we might not see everyone just because it's big, rolly water and we're losing the light, and it's hard to find everyone when they're spread out foraging on the banks.
See, and I think the cool thing here about that is, even though we're kind of pouring cold water on this idea that superpods are special when they only happen on the west side of San Juan Island, I think the cool takeaway of this, and I think this is really encouraging, is that just because they're not in the inland waters as often as they used to be, and we're not seeing these superpods in our own backyard, they are still living their lives and their culture, and I think that is a really awesome thing.
Yeah.
And kind of on the same token, but a little bit on the flip side of that, I think paying attention to how often and where superpods happen is still important, because what the data kind of tells us about their social cohesion and what we're now seeing based on where they show up in superpods is that if you want a lot of whales together in a place, they got to be well fed. There's got to be enough food in that place to support a lot of killer whales, or they have to have eaten a lot so they can just take some time to socialize. Mm-hmm. So the superpods might not mean, oh, someone's dead or, oh, someone's born. But, it probably is a good sign if we see a lot more superpods. That probably means that these whales are spending more time socializing and the area can support more animals. So it's not like superpods are meaningless. It's not like we shouldn't pay attention to when and where they happen. It's just, the superpods we see are not the only superpods that happen.
Right. We're not saying they're not important. They're just not important for the reasons that we as humans assign to them.
And Michael, you sort of alluded to this in your introduction to this topic, that sometimes people look for something southern resident killer whale related to, attribute a superpod to, but you also said something killer whale related, that sometimes people think that these southern resident superpods might be happening for something that is really outside of the immediate world of the southern residents. Who wants to touch this one?
I'm not 100% sure what you're alluding to, but I can think of multiple occurrences.
Pick one.
There's one fairly recent one, Jeff, that we've talked about.
Okay, right. Are we talking about Lolita, or are we talking about 109A3A?
Well, both.
Or both.
Let's start with Lolita, Tokate.
Which, is still southern resident related.
Yes.
She was a southern resident, but... there was a lot of discussion about Tokate's death corresponding with a superpod in the San Juan Islands.
So first point for us purists is that it wasn't a superpod. Not everybody was there, but we did have a big portion of the southern resident community gather on the west side of San Juan Island. This was in August when she was ailing and eventually died.
And then there was kind of along with that, the day, the news of her death actually came out, we didn't have that big group of southern residents on the west side anymore, but we did have the L12s, which, are a group a lot of people kind of assign Tokate to. Yeah. Without really good reason, I will say.
Yeah, I think we should debunk that one too. Honestly.
Yeah, really quickly. It's not really a demystifying thing, but while we're talking about it, I think it's important to say a lot of folks have said L25 Ocean Sun is Tokatei's mother. That is entirely within the realm of possibility, given her age and given when Tokatei was taken from the wild. But there is no reason to specifically think that there's a linkage there. L25 does not show up in the pictures of that capture that we have, let alone show up next to Tokatei.
No genetics have been done.
That's
another popular theory that's out there. And vocally,
she makes kind of calls from all three pods. The most recent recordings I heard, there were a lot of S16s in there, which are K-pod calls.
So I do agree with something you guys all said earlier. I do agree. I think everybody's going to hate us.
But I think it's important, like, so a lot of weight got put on first a quote-unquote superpod, like we said, not a real superpod based on all of our definitions, and then the L12s. And there's just so much there that just doesn't sit right with me because...
So just to be clear, the popular story that's out there is that they gathered because they knew she was dying, and that the L12 specifically, returned to this culturally important area on the west side of San Juan Island after her death. So that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of what people believed from that scenario.
And kind of now that we've kind of started with the L12s being there, it probably, in all likelihood, doesn't have a connection to Tokatei. But the next thing to kind of talk about is, for me, what I find bizarre, well, not bizarre, I think it's natural, but what I find frustrating is our instinct to assign places that are important to our connection with the whales, like the west side of San Juan Island, a particularly important role in their lives. And not to say the west side of San Juan Island is not important for them. They do a lot of stuff there. They forage, down on the south side of the island. They do a lot of socializing out there. I think it's a place, it's one of their waypoints. It's a place they travel to and then they stick for a while. So it's important. Like, it's an important place. But there are many of those important places within their range. There's up by the mouth of the Fraser, there's Swiftsure Bank. There's the reason I think we privilege the occurrence of any killer whale behavior, but especially superpods on the west side of San Juan Island, is because that's important to us. To me, it's very important to have southern residents on San Juan Island. It's important for my work, but it also is important to me emotionally. To see killer whales at Limekiln or at Land Bank, to gather as a human community to watch whales from shore, is important to me, and I think it's important to us. And I think there's a natural kind of connection that gets made in our brain that it also must be equally important to them. How important it is to our picture of them, it must also be that important for them. And I just don't think that that's necessarily warranted if we want to have a serious kind of talk about how these whales live their lives.
This is a human nature problem, I think, in that we see the whole world, especially with the natural world, from our own perspective of from our viewpoint, and have a very difficult time seeing the world from another animal's, possibly another animal's perspective. It's always coming from
It's a very
own.
egocentric.
Yes, and
right.
and I think that's a very human thing.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that I'm not trying to call everybody egotistical. It's just that's what it is.
It's a human. Yeah, we see the world and everything in the world from our perspective, and
we're the sun in this.
Right, and we can't get out of our own perspective to consider other possible perspectives.
Yeah. And then also there's the whole problem of, I don't believe in psychic abilities in killer whales or humans. So I
knew you were going to say that.
I have a hard time with the idea that they would somehow know.
Sarah's the only one who got that. Sorry.
That an animal. But, I'm more willing to kind of hear people out on that one because, weirdly, I'm more willing to hear about psychic powers a little bit because we don't know how we would even verify that. So I don't have scientific backing for the lack of psychic phenomenon, just that we don't have any good evidence for it. Whereas this, stuff about superpods and the west side of San Juan Island, I think we have good reason to know, to think and to be able to say San Juan Island is not the main place, that is not their gathering place. It certainly isn't anymore. If there's a place that's important for them to gather right now, it's Swiftsure Bank.
It's where the food is.
And if they were going to gather somewhere like culturally significant to honor Tokate and her death, wouldn't they have gone to Penn Cove?
Yeah, if that had happened, then we would be having a different conversation.
I would start questioning some of my fundamental understandings of how the universe works, I think, if the Southern residents showed up in Penn Cove.
Yeah, so, and for those who don't realize, that's where Tokate was actually captured.
And a place that they have not returned to our knowledge since then.
Right.
So that would have been remarkable in a very different way.
We probably would be having a different conversation.
Yes, we would. But a lot of people also commented on the behavior of the whales on that particular day. We have this great webcam up at Limekiln now, so a lot of people can watch, and they were commenting that, I believe this was the evening before she passed away, that they were seeing behaviors that they had never seen before during this gathering of all these different pods. And I, hearing that, I went back and watched the video. I was also out there in person a little bit further south, but to me, this is what we used to see from the Southern residents when they were here more in August, is these highly social intermingling groups, going back and forth, all kinds of bizarre surface behaviors. That used to be what we would see in the summer out there. So it's maybe remarkable to people who haven't had that sort of experience. But to me, it's how things used to be.
You used a phrase before we started recording that I think is really important here, which is shifting baseline, which is something that kind of is a phrase that gets coined in ecology about abundance and diversity of species usually, right? That there's not a lot of fish to catch, but it's happened so slowly that everybody's like, well, this is the normal level of fish. And I think what you're talking about is a shifting baseline of killer whale behavior. We expect now to see spread out foraging whales on the west side and not a lot else. So when they do the things they used to do all the time, it becomes remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole concept of generational amnesia, of just not knowing. We've talked about this before, and we've actually talked about this recently, because we have all these new professional guides and naturalists in the whale watching industry who know bigs, but some of them have never actually even seen Southern residents in person.
Most of them.
Right. As opposed to people who have been out here for 10, 20 plus years. So yeah, it's totally shifting baselines.
And if you look at what the Southern residents were doing that day through the lens of having spent a few years observing Biggs killer whales, it would look very different. And you would say, what is this? What's going on? But through the lens of Southern residents, it was a very normal day for them.
So don't hate us.
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
And to be clear, that doesn't make what they were doing any less amazing to see and beautiful and remarkable. And, I have my little cries sometimes when Southern residents are doing cool stuff at Limekiln and I get to be there. It's just remarkable because that's who they are. It's remarkable getting to see Southern residents be who they are. And who they are is this population of super socially connected, ideally socially active animals, more so than most any other species or populations I can name, right? There's not a lot of populations of animals, period, where every member of the population regularly comes together in a single group. That's remarkable.
And is really well known. I think that's something we were talking about before we started recording as well, is that they're all named and numbered. Like, we know every single individual in this population. We know their families and, who's related to who and how they're related.
Every single one of them.
Within, the last few decades. And I think that also leads us to some of our feelings towards killer whales, and specifically these killer whales.
For sure. I think when you see them, Michael used a great phrase, actively socializing. I mean, they're so actively socializing that it makes you feel like they're so excited to be together because they must not have been together in years. And I mean, we've seen that with Biggs killer whales, where they're super active socially and from two different matrilines that had been separated for 4 hours. And they came back together, and it was like, hey.
But I think, like, I've heard this before, and I'm sure that you guys have too, but there's been times where I've been on the west side or watching Southern residents engaged in this very socially active behavior. And sometimes during a superpod where you'll hear someone say, oh, yeah, well, they haven't been seen together since last August. Like, that was the last time that they were together. But it's just the last time we saw them together, you know.
On the west side of San Juan Island.
On the west side of San Juan Island.
It's this inability to kind of project into their lives and think, okay, I think people do kind of say, what would make me act that way with someone?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, if I hadn't seen them in a really long time, or we were celebrating something.
Sure.
And it's like, no, see, what's amazing is they don't need that excuse at all.
Right.
They're doing that with each other all the time. That's how they feel about each other, just all the time. And, you know, feel is a tough word because we don't know what's going on in their brain at all. But, like, that's what's cool.
Right.
That's what's cool. We don't need to put any extra mustard on that. Like, it's great as is.
Right. They are amazing and cool and incredible and fascinating for who they are outside of our, like, what we want them to be. It's incredible to watch, even if you didn't assign anything to it. It's just amazing. It's for me, and I say this a lot, it's like, to me, it's the coolest thing to see on this planet is to see killer whales, even if they're just traveling or sleeping, socializing, whatever it is. It's one of the coolest things to see.
Just living their lives.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe that kind of leads us into something else we were talking about before recording, which is our attitude as people towards killer whales generally, and I think this is going to be one that's really a bit unpopular. Our desire to kind of give them an elevated status above other species, sometimes above humans, depending on who you talk to.
Yeah, arguably a lot of the time, I would say.
And I want to start by saying, like, obviously in my life, I do not operate as if killer whales are like any other animal. My job is to study them. I would do it whether it was my job or not. I think they're the most interesting animals on the planet, bar none. I don't think there's an animal on the planet that can hold a candle to them in terms of things we can still learn and things that are interesting about them. But going back to this, moral philosophy, we like to give killer whales a heightened moral standing. We think killer whales deserve more than any other animal on the planet. I say we. I felt this way for most of my life up until, kind of a few years ago, really, when I started thinking about it more.
Can you give a specific example of kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So, for example, the movement in the States, and that has been kind of successful in other places in the world, to declare dolphins and whales as non-human people, while not declaring other animals the same, with the reasoning being, oh, they have such big brains, they're so social, which is really just another way of saying we see ourselves in them, and therefore we want to give them a heightened status, which I think is only natural, right? I mean, we do the same thing with apes and with monkeys. There's also people who feel the same way about octopus, right? Because they're so smart and they solve puzzles. I don't find that to be a satisfying moral philosophy of saying if an animal is more like us, it deserves more. Or if an animal is smarter, it deserves more. Or if an animal is more social, it deserves more, right? I feel like our moral philosophy of what animals deserve should be based on, are they experiencing pain? Are they experiencing discomfort? Are we creating more suffering in the world? And there's a whole neurobiological argument to be had about the nature of pain and how that correlates or doesn't with what we think of as intelligence. There's a whole other thing about what even is intelligence. But regardless, right, killer whales, for all of their, majesty, for how cool they are, for how beautiful they are, for how fascinating they are, I don't think it's consistent for us to privilege them over other species in terms of how we treat them. Certainly, I want to treat them well in the same way I want to treat other species well. And I want to preserve endangered populations of killer whales in the same way I'd want to preserve endangered populations of other animals. But I do think it's a common refrain and a common belief among people who love killer whales and people who are just kind of learning a bit about killer whales for the first time that, these killer whales are so smart, we really need to treat them more like people, which I think maybe scientifically can sometimes be true in terms of how we approach their behavior and culture, but in terms of our moral duty to killer whales and then to other animals, to non-killer whales, which is what I'll call all other animals, I don't think it's satisfying, I don't think it's consistent, and I don't think it leads us to a good place to say that a smart animal deserves more.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that kind of goes back to southern residents being the nice whales versus bigs being the mean whales. I have this conversation on the boat with the appropriate audiences, of course. I don't have this conversation with everybody, but, people are like, well, I want to, the bigs seem so vicious. Like they kill seals, they kill these animals that to us are very cute. And what I, try to bring up in a gentle way is who are we to assign value to a life? Sure, like a fish is, for most people different than a seal, but who are we to say that fish deserves less of a life than we're not?
There's a very active field of animal welfare study which is trying to understand pain and suffering in fish, right? Like there's an active field of research looking at that. There is no serious. There was this long-standing kind of scientific myth that fish didn't have the neurological equipment to feel pain, which pain is tricky because it requires consciousness, and consciousness is tricky because it's fundamentally tricky. But there's no real reason to say that the suffering of a seal is any morally worse than the suffering of a fish, right?
So you're saying all killer whales are mean and vicious, not just the bigs.
That is what I'm saying. They are all mean and vicious predators.
And everybody just clicked off the episode and stopped listening right there.
But
I'm
burn
just
their
kidding.
phone.
I mean, this goes back also to human nature, where we're always trying to fit things into boxes, and us versus them, and hierarchies of ranking of importance.
Sure.
But I do think, and you mentioned this, Michael, I mean, obviously the four of us in some ways do put killer whales ahead of many things on this planet because the four of us, our lives revolve around them.
Oh yeah, to be clear, I'm a rank hypocrite. I personally, and how I live my life, privilege killer whales above most other things.
Yeah,
just
I think
about
we all
everything.
do.
Except your cats.
Except my cats and my wife. Sometimes the cats fluctuate. Yeah, I think we all do, we all are in lines of work that kind of require us to you got to be a little bit killer whale crazy, I think.
Absolutely.
Sure.
So why do you think that is? What about killer whales inspires that in people?
They're mystical.
They're magical.
Tying that back to the lead-in.
You brought up, I think before we started recording, you brought up the fact that we've talked a little bit about it as we've gone, that we do know them all individually, right?
Yeah, knowing them as individuals, in some cases, we think we have insights into their personalities, their family histories. That certainly gives them, more value in a sense to us, and certainly more of a connection than, a nameless animal that's part of a kind of, blank population that we don't understand to this level. I brought up the example of not really having a problem watching Big's killer whales hunt sea lions, unless it's one of the branded sea lions that we know, and then it's like
183R.
Then it's like back off. I know
Right.
I know that individual. I know his history, and so I'm more emotionally invested in that particular animal. And so I think the uniqueness of killer whale populations, where we get to see the same individuals year after year in the same location, builds this affinity for them that makes them, rise in value in our opinion.
And I'm not ashamed to admit, that even though we've had this conversation and I follow it, that there have been times when I see a lot of like are the same things I see in people in killer whales. You know, like they're intelligent, they're social, they're what have you. But I do have to like stop myself and like really think about what drives me and draws me to them.
Well, and behaviorally and evolutionarily, there are interesting parallels that are worth studying between humans and killer whales, right? Like the fact that they are cosmopolitan, that they learn how to get food in different areas through social learning and culture, the fact that they're cultural in the first place, they have strong kin bonds, they have yeah, and, you know, gene culture, coevolution, all kinds of cool stuff. Menopause, like, they are one of, you know, the few species on the planet that have a long post-reproductive life like humans. There are cool evolutionary parallels that are worth thinking about and help us think about ourselves and our own evolutionary history. That doesn't mean they're just water people, right?
Right.
Which, like, I guess I should say, I also understand that there are many native traditions that do treat them as kin and as relations under the water, and I do not at all mean to denigrate that at all, because that is absolutely not my place to be talking about even a little bit. But I think even that, right, they are relations under the water. They have specific things about them that are different. We can't just blanket treat them like people and give them the exact same kind of moral valence.
Or assign our own emotions to them. Right. I think that was something we talked about too, is like we kind of like to anthropomorphize and like assign our own emotions. And we know that they're very emotional animals potentially. But Monika, you said it really well before we, you know, kind of hit the record button a couple of times, that, you know, they're not necessarily feeling the same things we are. They're not feeling the same emotions in that situation that we would necessarily feel.
Yeah, from, you know, studying their social lives and their brain physiology, we have every reason to believe that they're capable of a wide range of emotions, but that's not the same as feeling the same things that we would feel in a given situation.
I think, to me, that's one of the things that makes them most fascinating and worthy of my life's obsession.
Sure.
Is that we go out and we watch them, and we know they have relationships with each other, family, friends, and we know that they have complex culture and that there's a lot going on, and we never know what we're going to see. And we do see evidence that there's something there, but we don't know what it is. And I think, to me, that's what's so fascinating. And I'll throw an example out that I think we all witnessed last year, and it's the two brothers who we don't know what was going on, and we loved it.
To clarify, T125A and T128.
Yes, and we did a whole podcast on that encounter, and it's fun to make up our own interpretations and stories about what was going on, but all we know is that there was something going on, but we have no idea what they were feeling, what they were thinking, and what actually transpired. But we knew that it was a unique enough event to see that we knew there was something going on, but we'll never know. But just knowing that there's something there, that we're not just watching, you know, something, we're watching something deep and something complex. What that is, we don't know, but and combined with knowing who they are, it's pretty cool, and that I think draws people into obsession.
So for anyone still listening that hasn't thrown their phone or their listening device into this ocean, don't litter. I think we should talk about J35.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is a huge one that we all talk about, or not all, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of people talk about when we're talking about
carpet bombing, man.
Yeah, I can't wait to
human
lose
emotion.
The last five listeners.
That listening just like keeps going down.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't imagine many of your listeners don't know about J35, but we could do a quick recap.
We should do a recap just in
anyways.
case.
So J35 is a southern resident killer whale female who basically had a calf that died very soon after its birth, or potentially was stillborn. Although there's some thought that some folks say they saw the calf swimming alive, but didn't get any photos. And J35 then carried the body of this calf for 17 days, really without only letting it go from our observations momentarily and probably on accident, and then diving after it, carrying it back to the surface. So this kind of started getting referred to as a tour of grief. There was a lot of talk about how J35 was sending a message to people about, the state of the ocean and the state of the southern resident killer whale population. And particularly the word grief got used a lot about how, to describe what J35 was exhibiting and feeling at the time. It's a tough one to talk about for me because I think for all of us, because it was a hard time. I think we were all feeling grief.
That was a very difficult time here.
And I like to use this example because I think I try to use it as an exercise to talk about how we can talk about killer whale social relationships and emotion using the language of what we actually know and can observe about them, rather than our feelings about what they're doing. So grief is a human emotion, right? It describes a human experience that most people will go through, unfortunately, multiple times in their life. It's very universal. Killer whales, we don't know if they experience human grief, as Monika was saying. Like, we know they have the equipment for deep, complex emotional lives, but that doesn't mean they feel human analogs or analogs of human emotion. What we know about this behavior, this kind of behavior of carrying the bodies of dead animals, usually calves in cetaceans, it correlates with brain size. Species with bigger brains do it more often, are more likely to do it. It tends to be mothers carrying around their calves. In killer whales specifically, we know that the mother-calf relationship is the core relationship in the population. That had that calf survived, it would have been, a lifelong social partner, a lifelong associate of J35's. And we know that J35 didn't show signs that, she didn't play with the calf. She didn't attempt to eat the calf. So it's not like she thought of it as a food item or as a plaything. And the one thing we know for sure is she wasn't ready to let go.
Yep.
So when I think about what J35 was showing, there's clearly like an emotional valence behind it. What that emotion is, I don't know. But it comes, everything we know about killer whales says that it's related to this tight mother-calf bond, this bond that, she would have carried this calf for probably about 18 months before it was born. So to me, I try to avoid the anthropomorphizing, not because I think killer whales feel less than us or that they are somehow more like animalistic than human emotions, but because I think it is not accurate and maybe inadequate to just look at what J35 did and was experiencing and just slap human grief
and just
on
call it grief
and just say it's grief. We figured it out.
Yeah.
I don't think that does the mystery of it and the intensity of it the justice it kind of earns. Yeah. So I think it's worth like thinking about the words we use and as much as possible rooting what we're saying in things we actually know about the animals, rather than just immediately projecting what we think we know about ourselves and about how they relate to us onto it.
I don't disagree with what you said, but I have used the word grief in this context as the closest human analog.
It's nice
for
shorthand.
what we saw. I don't think whatever she was going through was for our benefit.
No.
In any stretch of the imagination. But what she did resonated with people in a way that we honestly have not seen before, where this became a global story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I think the idea that there is a mother-calf relationship that's that strong that it could elicit that type of response resonated with people on a very deep level. And I think that brought a lot of attention to the Southern residents that they didn't have before.
And I said it too, like when it was happening and even after, and I, probably have said it this year, that she did more to bring awareness to her population than we've done in the last several. And I'm not saying she did it because she wanted to bring attention to it.
Right. There was no message for us,
right?
Other than watching in awe and as understanding as we could be to what was going on
as observers. What she did, right?
The way I've put it before is she wasn't sending a message, but a message was received.
Right.
That's like
perfect.
We got a message from it, whether or not she, she didn't intend to do it. She was doing that for her,
right?
But we still were watching, and the message still got out.
And I've used the word grief as well because I think too, when we're talking with people who are maybe not as familiar with killer whales or are just being introduced to this topic and the various facets of it, that grief is a word that they understand and then can,
Yeah.
But
no, I think it's, it's a much quicker, easier way to talk about it, especially with folks who are maybe new to killer whales, than to say she was feeling some sense of killer whale mother-calf bonding that did not allow her to let go of her calf.
Right.
That is very long when the closest kind of human analog that we can probably come to is grief. Right. I think that's a fair point. I do think, I do. It bothered me though, the idea that she was sending a message, that she was intentionally sending it. It felt, it made it feel cheap. It made it feel performative when it wasn't. Yeah. It wasn't for us.
That's a human-centric way of looking at it.
Yeah.
It's not that different to me than the killer whales in the Strait of Gibraltar are sending a message about the state of the oceans by attacking sailboats.
And the last listener just clicked off.
Well, the Strait of Gibraltar whales are good comrades in there, but. I mean, we didn't talk about we didn't talk about Gibraltar whales before we hopped on, but
we didn't. But
it's
that's
right
why
here
I brought
in front
it
of us now.
It's kind of the same vibe here of that. What they're doing must be all about us and sending a message to us.
When it's just killer whale cow tipping. Is probably. I mean,
that's a T-shirt. Right there.
Oh my God.
Killer whale cow tipping.
I like it. Monica's very quiet right now.
And just to reiterate kind of what we've been saying, to me, the fact that it's not about us makes it more interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's what I was trying to see. You always have a way of, I was trying to say that earlier, when I was talking about the incident with the brothers, but you have a way of taking what I'm thinking and it takes me 15 or 20 sentences and you can do it in like a phrase.
She's a very eloquent interpreter.
Absolutely.
I agree. It's so boring to think about a population of animals that is just thinking about, wonder what the people are going to do with this one. I mean, I've definitely had whales do things where I'm sure they were messing with me in that moment, but in general, the fact that they are their own animals living their own lives is why we're fascinated by them. I wouldn't want to remove that mystery by assuming we are at the center of it.
No, because there's just so much more. We're just tip of the iceberg, right? There's so much more to learn about them. Like the longer I spend, I know this is going to sound cheesy. The longer I spend with killer whales, I feel like the less I know about them.
And the more fascinating they become. Because like I was saying, you never know what you're going to see, but oftentimes you see stuff that just it gives you so many questions and so much appreciation, and it's hard to put into words, but I'm sure like within
Monika
5 minutes,
will
Monika will come up with like a three-word phrase and capture exactly what I'm thinking.
But I think we talked about this earlier too, especially when you came down this winter to Bremer Bay. We kind of went in with this like box of killer whale knowledge that we had, learned, right? But we'd learned it about southern residents or about big killer whales, and they don't fit in the same box. Like, they don't fit in a box. We like to have these boxes. We like to label things. As humans, we like to do this, and it just doesn't fit.
Right. How many times when we were watching killer whales in Bremer did we say, we don't know anything about killer whales?
Yeah. And then there were some people who were like, I figured them out.
Well, Dave Elford and I were having this conversation on the boat like the other day, talking about kind of bemoaning the lack of funding and government interest in basic science research on southern resident killer whales and on Biggs killer whales, and everything needs to be so targeted at a particular management thing, which I think obviously endangered species you want to target on conservation and management. But we kind of came to the agreement, like, yeah, we know probably like less than a tenth of the facts there are to know about southern resident killer whales. Just southern residents, like the most well-studied killer whales on the planet. The amount we still don't know is just many, many times greater than everything we do know, even after decades and decades of research. And this is Dave Elford saying this, who I constantly think of the person who, if I have a killer whale question, I'll just ask him and he'll know. So yeah, it's I think there's so much mystery to them. I'm not a big mystic or spiritual person, so I don't know if I use those words necessarily. But I think, after of all the debunking we do and all of this kind of like naysaying we're doing here, because we're all like interested in facts about killer whales being known, I think we all still feel that mystery and that draw and that kind of sense of wonder. I don't think you have to sacrifice accuracy and truth to instill that sense of wonder about these animals.
Yeah, I would agree.
Absolutely.
So you listed earlier a lot of the parallels that we see in killer whales and in humans, their long lives, their lifelong social bonds, menopause. Another one is vocal communication or language. Do you want to touch on that one a little bit?
Yeah, I do. Let's talk about language. As I think a lot of the listeners will know, and as killer whales have really cool communication systems. They make all these really interesting discrete calls. They are unique to particular social groups. They seem to be culturally transmitted, mostly along matrilineal lines. Interesting thing is there's some cool there's some cool models out there trying to model the evolution of killer whale vocal dialects, and it kind of looks like you don't get to cool vocal dialects like killer whales have just by maternal inheritance and then error accumulation. It just turns into a mess. You have to have maternal inheritance, errors, and then a little bit of like transmission between groups and a little bit of trying to sound different from the group who's really closely related to you. So they're doing all these really interesting cultural things. Killer whale communication is cool, but there's a tendency with killer whales, and actually just with whales in general, to assume that if we dive deep enough, and if we get the right AI model trained on it, and we have the right, observation method, eventually at the bottom of this communication system, this alien-seeming communication system, there's just going to be human language, basically. There's just going to be something that is structured fundamentally like human language. To the degree that so many people who talk about killer whale vocals already use the term language when they talk about it, kind of in casual conversation. And there's so much good reason to think that their communication is more complex than we understand, and that there's more happening there. Simply by the fact that it is complex vocalizations that we still haven't figured out how they match up with behavior or meaning yet. So there's clearly stuff we don't get, but there's not any sign that what's at the base of that is just the recreation of human language, as if human language is the goal that all communication systems are trying to evolve towards. And yeah, this has mostly been happening lately in humpback whales and in sperm whales, different groups, bizarrely, all of whom seem to say that talking to whales is the first step to talking to aliens, talking about this and people spinning off into various directions with it. But I just And I'm kind of paraphrasing a really great article that maybe we can include in the show notes.
Sure.
Absolutely.
By Luke Rendell, who's a scientist who's been studying whale culture and whale communication for many decades. Like, I wish we could just appreciate whale communication for the cool thing it is and the mysteries it has, rather than trying to find ourselves in it. The phrase he used is, we should not be I think something like, we should not be trying to use whales as a balm for our cosmic loneliness.
I need that on a shirt.
Like we're just trying to find other people, right? Like, we're trying to find ourselves again, when what we're finding is aliens, right? We're finding alien, alien communication systems. And what we want to find is human language again. And I get that, and I feel that, but we just can't assume that.
And I think that the four of us in this room, and many others, and probably lots of people who are listening, have found the appreciation of and the magic in whales for who they are, and not something assigned, and not, leading us to more people, but leading us to this other life form that is just cool in their own right.
I like that you think people are still listening.
Yeah, it's great that you think this isn't just for us. I don't know, Monika, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that too, because you've done more work than I have on the acoustic side and on the trying to figure out what any of this means.
I'm very careful about not using the word language when I talk about killer whale communication, in part because we tend to hear people say, oh, they speak different languages, and that's part of what makes different groups different. But, we have a little bit of evidence that maybe they can understand each other, even though they're using different vocalizations, which implies that it's not like English to Chinese, right? But different badges of social identity as to, what group do I belong to? Yet there's something inherent within my discrete call that will convey information that, about what's going on, or my emotional state. And we just, despite 50 years of research, haven't cracked anything about how their communication system works. And I think because, like you said, we've approached it from a very human linguistic perspective and not found parallels. So it is an alien communication system. And I don't know that language is the right word for that.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of using the word language.
As am I.
I'm just going to admit that.
Yeah.
And again, it's like, I think the reason we sometimes slip and do that is because, like with grief and like with, it's a good shorthand. We're trying to explain to people with an analog how killer whale society works. And we've set up, okay, well, a matriline is like a family, and a pod is like a bigger social group. And then these different populations are like, different cultures that speak different languages. And that immediately sets the parallel. Mm-hmm. And I don't think
what people understand.
Right. I don't think it's always necessarily a bad thing to use those words as an analogy in the context of describing culture. But as you say, Monika, it's still not perfectly accurate, even using it as an analogy.
Sure.
When you're among purists.
which we are.
Which is just another example, I think, of like, there's a lot we can see of ourselves in killer whales. There's a lot we might be able to learn about our own evolution by looking at how stuff, happened in this other top predator in a different ecosystem. But we're not going to find perfect one-to-one correlations all the time.
No, it'd be so boring if we did.
Yeah, well, it'd be easy. It'd make our jobs easier, though. It'd make scientists' jobs a lot easier.
Yeah, but I
don't think we wouldn't like
We're not
this.
in it for the easiness, Michael.
I don't think we'd like what we're doing as much.
I'd study fruit flies if I was interested in easy. And then the one fruit fly scientist who was listening just logged off.
So if there is anybody that's still listening, and we're really curious to get some feedback of what you think about this episode.
You can send all your complaints to Monika at orcabehaviorinstitute.org.
And if you log back in and you're really angry at us and we've ruined killer whales for you, we want to hear about that too.
But hopefully
we've not ruined it.
I'm joking.
Made the argument that they're even more fascinating without this human mysticism overlaid.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think that's the big takeaway. Killer whales are great, just not for the reason any of you think they are.
But I think that's the reason we bring it up. It's like a recurring topic when we're, sitting at cease and desist late at night. Shout out to.
Oh yeah, I want to go to cease.
Sure.
Cool.
Well, and go.
That they're so amazing as these creatures without the mysticism, without the woo, without the, magic surrounding them, that they are still these amazing complex creatures that we don't know nearly as much as we think we do about them. And that is cool.
It's very cool. I mean, Michael, you just said it, where the southern residents who've been the best studied population of whales on this planet. And like, there's so much that we don't know. There's so little that we do know. And like, that's what makes it fascinating.
Yeah. There's so many buttons we still need to figure out. Anyways, that's for another podcast.
And reprogram.
Yeah.
So if you have feedback on this episode, we definitely would love to hear from you. You can reach out to us at
I don't want to hear. No, I'm just kidding. I don't want to hear. No.
After the Breach podcast at gmail.com. Any suggestions for
Remember that I'm very fragile
about?
Right now because it's the middle of our season. No, I'm just kidding.
And it really is early in the season. We had an incredible May. So if you're thinking about coming out with us this season, definitely book a trip. I think we had whales on 98% of our tours in May, which was our highest number for any May that we've been tracking.
And on our next episode, we'll bring back Meet the Matroline.
Yes.
I know it's been a
few.
It's been a complaint.
And we need to catch people up on the latest sightings on the next episode too, because it's been a while and there's been
a lot going
on here. So for the two of you that are still listening,
I feel like this episode could have gone on for a lot longer, but thanks for at least doing a part one so far. We can always come back to this.
Oh yeah.
We definitely are going to have to do a part two.
Well, we can do a part two based on all of the responses we get. And for all those who have responses, joke's on you. I'm not on social media. You can't get me.
I would be super interested in theories, that people might have to send in, or interpretations of certain events that we could address in part two.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be great. That's a great idea. Yeah. So send feedback, questions, interpretations, theories. Please send that to us. Appreciate all the feedback we got from our last episode with Judith Scott from Iceland and on the Icelandic killer whales.
And we have a couple more spots left on our Sunday day for our workshop in August 25th. So if you're interested in signing up, shoot us an email.
And Sarah has a very important message for everybody.
Stay safe out there. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of After the Breach podcast. If you've enjoyed it and want to help us out, please share this with your friends, family, and any other whale-loving folks you can think of. We would also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have topics you're interested in and would like to hear on the show, please send us an email. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find us on Instagram as @AfterTheBreach and on Facebook as After the Breach Podcast. And if you'd like to go whale watching with us, then come on up to San Juan Island, Washington State. We run tours with Maya's Legacy Whale Watching, departing just steps away from the ferry landing in beautiful downtown Friday Harbor. It's a great destination for a day trip or multiple days and offers some of the best whale and wildlife viewing in the world. We would love to take you out on the water to see the amazing whales we talk about on our podcast. You can book a tour through the company website at www.sjiwhalewatch.com and make sure to mention you're a podcast listener when you book. Thanks again for listening, and remember, stay safe out there. Welcome to...
Already? Like you're already.
It's going to be a good podcast.